Hello again, and welcome to episode 201 of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Thank you for joining us for the podcast where our real stories are so much more interesting than fiction. Like this one. In this episode, we talked to Jason Prokowiew about turning old pain into a new kind of peace. He joins us from Connecticut. Jason, welcome to the Stories from Real Life today.
Thanks, Melvin. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
We're going to talk a lot about your story of your dad and about your own story of discovering more about yourself. So you spent
Yeah.
over 50 hours interviewing your father before he passed. How did the role of journalist or lawyer help you process the stories that might have been too painful to simply hear as a son?
Yeah, I think I was neither of those things at the time that I started to interview him. I guess I was it was the beginnings of my journalism because I was 21 at the time that I started recording him. So that was 1999, and I was doing it as a college project. I had gone through a class the semester before I started recording my dad where we watched a film about the Nazi invasion of Belarus. The film's called Come and See. And there were so many things in that movie, which is a fairly violent film about this invasion, that just felt familiar based upon things that I had heard my dad say. So I went to talk to my professor about how similar some of these moments from this film were to my father's stories. And he asked these questions about my father's background that I did not know the answers to. Like, how did he survive that invasion? How was that for him on a day to day basis? And what had happened to his family, his mother, his sister? I knew he had been disconnected from them during the war, at the start of the war, but I had never really asked him about the circumstances surrounding that separation. So there was a curiosity that was piqued in me, and thankfully there was a curiosity that was piqued in my professor because I went back to him shortly thereafter and asked about possibly getting credit to go and sit down with my father and interview him and talk to him about his stories. Thankfully, there's a month-long winter term where I went to college, Oberlin College, that's supposed to be for independent research. So I used that month to go to Florida, where my father was a snowbird. He was living in Sarasota area for the winter, and to start interviewing him. And at first, he was like so confused about why anybody would give me academic credit to talk to him about his life. And at first, he was very hesitant to talk to me. There was a lot of, and I bring this up in the book, there was just a lot of him dodging the questions, getting up to make a cup of coffee, getting up to make some toast, anything to get away from the questions that I was asking, because I was really curious as he was telling his stories, like, what was this like to be 10 years old and to be shot at by a plane? Because that's how he first learned that the war had come to Belarus. Was he was 10 years old in a field at summer camp, far away from his mother, who was in the capital of Belarus, Minsk, and this plane just came down from the sky and started shooting at him. So he had told this story. He told it in a dramatic, set way that I remember hearing it in childhood. And I wanted to know, what was that like? Not, don't tell me the pat story of how this went down for you. Tell me what that was like for you on that day. What happened after you ran back to your cabin and saw your counselors and the other campers? What happened when you went back to Minsk and you found out that your apartment was gutted, essentially burned down, bombed, and you were alone? What was that like for a 10-year-old? And that was the struggle for him at first. He didn't want to field those questions. There was a resistance to that.
I completely understand that. My dad had a traumatic childhood, and also at the age of 10, he had a life defining experience where his abusive
What was that? May
father,
I ask?
yeah, his father was very abusive, very, very abusive. And as a 10-year old, he decided he did not want to see his mother or his siblings abused anymore, and he was going to shoot his dad. And he actually tried to do it, and the gun jammed.
Wow. So
So,
you talked to your dad about that history.
and I was very young because he died when I was 13 years old.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
very early lessons. I can understand some of
Yeah.
the trauma that you're having to relive through your dad and within yourself as well.
Yeah. 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 I'd be very curious to. I know I'm supposed to be the one talking, but now I'm very curious about how you handled that history for yourself.
We can weave that in as we go along. I don't want to make this about me.
Sure.
But
Sure.
speaking of weaving, you used a braided narrative structure for your book War
Yeah.
Boys. What was the most
Yeah.
challenging aspect of balancing your father's survival epic with your own internal journey as a gay man in suburban America?
Yeah. I think the struggle was quite real for a very long time. Think what I found as a writer to be the problem was that I had a traumatic upbringing with my father because my father carried a lot of his own wartime trauma into parenthood. And that was not initially part of the plan for War Boys to bring up my background. But around 2018, when I was working on the manuscript, I was reading a lot of memoir that incorporated sort of a deep dive into the writer's experience of whatever topic they were writing about. And I saw this opportunity to bring in some of my story of being raised by this person with this trauma and what that meant to me. Once I kind of decided that that was the plan, bring myself more into it, I found this new struggle of absolutely the story that I had about my upbringing matters and mattered, but it didn't quite weigh out the same in the manuscript against what my father had endured in the war. So I was trying to essentially have his story kind of competing with my story originally. And then as I kept working on the manuscript and took it to a year-long class called a memoir incubator, I worked with a writer whose name is Mike Scalise, who wrote this memoir called the Next Great Catastrophe, which I admired before I even met Mike. And then I brought my book to Mike, and I give Mike a lot of credit for kind of helping me conceive of how to tell these two stories so that they were not in competition. Um, and I had all of these interviews, as you mentioned. I had these 50 hours of interviews with my dad, which were interspersed sometimes in the manuscript as it was then. Um, but Mike suggested that I use the interviews as an interruption point in my dad's retelling of his stories to interject sometimes. So you see suddenly a son interrupting his father and saying, "What was I like, Dad?" And I was very resistant to that idea at first. I said, I can't interrupt my dad's stories with like my little interview questions. And he's like, "Yes, you can." And I said, I fought it. And he was like, "Have you ever seen The Princess Bride?" And I was like, "Yeah, I have." He's like, "Well, you know, Peter Falk and the grandson, uh, they interrupt the fairy tale to go back to this point where you see them in discussion about the fairy tale." And so I had kind of like an aha moment, and I was like, "Okay, this worked there. Could it work for War Boys?" And what Mike was really arguing for was that these interruptions on the tapes could kind of act as like a present moment in the memoir to allow there to be what we discussed as like the now of the book. Like you have the history in Belarus, you have the history in Massachusetts after I was born, and then you have these interviews that could kind of interrupt either and remind the reader there's also a 21-year-old son and a 72-year-old father talking about these moments. And what I found and what Mike was again arguing for was that the interviews and that sort of now through line could act as a way to make scenes in Belarus and the scenes in Massachusetts speak to each other instead of having them compete. So suddenly I had this tactic that allowed me to take out that idea that I had to make these stories equal. So now I think they more speak to each other, and I'm able to inform what was going on in Belarus with stories from what was happening later in my childhood or what was happening on the tapes without me needing to weigh them out equally.
That's a really interesting way of telling the story. To tell you a little bit more about my story that I mentioned earlier, I wrote a book about it. It's called The Strength of a Thousand Sons. And in this, I followed my maternal or paternal line, and starting with my great grandfather and then ending with my son. And I talked about how my dad intentionally broke the cycle of abuse when he was
Wow.
10 years old. He said he would never, he said he
Yeah.
didn't know how to be a dad, but he said he was just going to do the opposite of everything that his dad did.
Yeah. Right. Right.
And so I talked about those things that he learned and the things that he taught me, and then things that I learned that I taught my son.
Yeah.
And
Powerful.
patterns don't have to mirror each other, but they're
Right.
definitely impacted by each other.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's so interesting you say that, how you broke that cycle in that way. I often say, and I don't mean to, and I don't think in the book I'm, villainizing my father. I'm trying to paint him as complex and say there was absolutely good and bad to his parenting style. But I often say that he taught me so many ways how not to be. And it sounds similar, like you're looking at these actions and determining, well, I won't do those for these reasons.
Right. Absolutely. So, did you notice a shift in your father's tone or language during the course of this 50 hours where he might have gone from survivor mode to father mode?
Yeah, I don't know if I would say I felt like he went to a father mode. I think he did. I think it's correct to say he was in some kind of survivor mode. And I think a part of that survivor mode was to tell the stories the way that he wanted to tell the stories, that he had grown accustomed to telling so that they were safe for him to tell. The interviews were the disruption to that. His annoying 21-year-old son was the disruption to that. And the shift absolutely occurred. And I would say it probably occurred fairly early in the process because I spent that month, like I mentioned, interviewing him. And I think within that month, there was a shift. There was an emotional shift for him where perhaps he realized that I wasn't going away, that I wasn't going to stop asking the questions, that he had me in his house for a month with the intent of getting up every day and doing an hour of recordings if we could. And I think we did maybe 3 or 4 a week because it was pretty heavy work for both of us. But very early on, he had an emotional moment, an emotional breakthrough where we had finished recording for the day, and I was sitting with my mom in the living room, and he was at the table behind us, and I suddenly just heard him crying, and I turned around, and he was wiping his eyes, and whatever we had covered that day in the interviews had kind of brought him to that moment. And I would say it was probably 2 weeks into our process, and my mom and I just looked at him like kind of in shock that he was sitting there crying. And he said, and I write this in the book, "Don't you feel bad for me? Don't you?" And I got up and walked around and kissed him on his head, said, "Of course I do, Papa. Of course I do." So uh, there was just this kind of moment of breakthrough, I would say, in the interview process, in that connection. And we had other emotional moments in that first month. I also write in the book about there was one particular night where I had bad nightmares because of what my father had said. And the nightmare was actually that a plane was coming down from the sky and shooting at me. And it startled me awake. And I went off to the living room because I couldn't go back to sleep. And I found my dad. It was the middle of the night. And I told him I had had this nightmare. And he said he had his own nightmares that night. And that's why he was awake. And he said this line that is also in the book. He said, and he said it to me, but also kind of off into the distance because he was looking out a window. And he said, "You damn kid, you're stirring it all up for me." And that was another moment of this change in him. And from going to the point where he was hesitant to even sit down and talk to me on these tapes, transitioned to kind of an excitement on his part to sit down and talk to me about his stories. So I think the hardest part was those first 2 or 3 weeks. And then it became something that he was excited to do. And when he brought me to the airport to go back to Ohio to go to college, he commented that he was looking forward to finishing the tapes with me because we'd only gotten so far in that first month in his story. And I said, we will continue, Dad. And it was, 3 years before I graduated college and really had time to go back and finish the tapes, which I did in 2001 with him. But he was excited by that point. He like wanted to sit down with me and have those conversations. Um, and again, I can't say it was all rainbows and butterflies because there were times again in the 2001 recordings where I was pushing for answers or an exploration that he was resistant to. And he fought me on it sometimes, but I just did what I had learned to do in 1999, which was just to sit and wait it out. Sometimes we would call it for the day and I'd just be like, "Okay, you don't want to talk. I get it. Do it tomorrow," and we would leave it. But I felt this kind of excitement towards the end from him, and we both kind of expressed a disappointment when we reached a kind of a logical endpoint to the interviews.
Okay. You mentioned your dad's homeland being Belarus. And I actually, for some reason, have had a strange interest in Belarus for a long time. And
Okay.
for people who don't know, Belarus is now is considered part of Eastern Europe, and it used to be part of the Soviet Union, and has a hardline president who's kind of an ally with Putin. Lukashenko, I
Yeah.
believe is how you pronounce his name, and he's been there for a long time. And so they have probably more ties to that line of thinking, the Soviet line of thinking, than some other Eastern European countries. Did you find in any way your dad holding on to any of those Soviet types of hardline mental traps that he might have carried from childhood?
I don't think so. And almost the opposite in a way. I think there were some advantages to how he carried some of the Soviet teachings into parenthood. And, you could have a different answer from one of my sisters because I am the youngest of 13 and I have 9 sisters. But for instance, the ideal in communism was sort of this equality among genders. And I would say I never saw from my father any sort of sexism towards my sisters that would sort of indicate they shouldn't be able to do anything that his 4 sons should be able to do. So, in that way, I think there was that advantage. And I also think my dad was very critical of Communist Party by the time he reached the US because he, as the book goes into, was adopted by a Nazi who occupied a part of Belarus and retreated with the Germans when they retreated from Belarus and was taught within then German schools that Hitler was the bee's knees. It was like now it was all about this was the right way to run a country. Whereas before he had learned that Stalin had the right way to run a country. And he saw both of these countries being run the way they were run, and he thought they were both not being run very well. And he rejected a lot of those ideals. For instance, he was raised in an atheist community in an atheist household. And he himself, in his mid teens, found God and decided that he wanted to be a Catholic. So that was another big change from what he had been taught.
That's really fascinating. Really fascinating. And in the book, you describe him as an imposing presence in your house. How did you recreate that kind of an atmosphere for the reader in the book?
Yeah, I think those are some of the hardest parts for me to write because I did take the reader back to my childhood And my father was an active drinking alcoholic from the time that I was born and well before I was born. So, I want to say like I am the youngest of his children, and all of my brothers and sisters have their own stories to tell. I've sort of incorporated some of those stories here to give a larger sense of the violence within my home, but I had to also bring in stories of my own abuse and neglect, which again were the hardest parts for me to write, and then the hardest parts for me to share with early readers, people who were giving me feedback on the manuscript. So you're going to go back to points where my dad was 10, and you're also going to go back to points where Jason is 7, 8, 9, 10, and living in this environment where, I describe it in the book as like we're all trying to carefully walk around this human landmine, and how do we avoid one of the explosions from my father. So I think there's a lot of very kind of visceral retellings of some hard moments that I experienced, and also some retellings from siblings with a certain degree of anonymity. I tell those stories to bring in that atmosphere of our home.
Okay, you mentioned having 12 siblings and your dad being Catholic. I'm just going to guess that your mom was Catholic too, with with that many kids.
Correct. Good guess. Yes.
So how did your own sense of individuality sustain itself with basically a crowd inside of your house? I'm sure they weren't all living there at the same time if you're the youngest.
Yeah. Yeah, they were not. It was a lot emptier by the time I was born in 1976 for sure. Many had already moved out, gotten married, were having their own families. I always joke I was an uncle 6 years before I was born. Um,
I was an uncle once
uh,
too,
there,
so I can relate to that too.
there you go. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. Yeah, not very useful uncle when you're first born. Environment was one where I, now in retrospect, adopted techniques to just stay safe, and part of that was to be very quiet, to make myself as invisible as possible. So, I kind of operated under this false idea that I was shy for a long time, probably until my early 20s. I don't think I'm shy at all. And I don't think anybody who is close in my life would say that I'm a shy person. But uh, shyness, staying in the background, observing, figuring out what's safe in the environment, who's safe, who's not safe, were all techniques that I used to survive that environment. And I think being queer was one way that I was able to really find my way out of that system, because what I needed as a 16-year-old gay boy was not something that I was necessarily going to find within that household. So I started to reach out to my community at school. I found other queer kids to be in community with. I found the teachers who would support me in my queerness. That was a real differentiating, helpful thing for me. And also, about when I was 16, and I cover this in the book, I kind of figured out that I had a talent for singing. And this talent was really supported by the music program at my school. So it gave me a community within the music program to explore these things that I was good at. And suddenly I was realizing, okay, I'm have things I can do in this world besides be at home and be scared, and be quiet and figure out how to be just safe. Those those moments when I was 16, which these kind of things were happening at the same time. I was coming out, I was figuring out I was good at music, were kind of moments that really flipped my trajectory and gave me like a little beam of light in the distance. Like, I'm going to follow that, and I'm going to go towards that instead of I'm going to stay back here and be scared of life.
All right, you talk about loneliness and shame in your book. To what extent do you think those emotions were inherited from your father, who obviously, as you mentioned, lost everything when he was just 10 years old?
Yeah. I think the quietness around things that we think are shameful was as something that I saw my father doing during the time of our recordings. So there was a connection in my head to his experiences and my experiences and what we are so embarrassed about that we keep undercover. And there's been a lot of those shameful moments in my writing over the last probably especially 6 or 7 years. And I'm just thinking that the ways that sharing my most shameful stories has opened me to the possibility that they're not as shameful as I thought they were and was acting as though they were also true for my father. I think there was a shame that he felt that he was affected by what he experienced. And I think that's what I saw in those moments where he was crying or where he was woken by these nightmares about what we were recording during our recording sessions, where he felt embarrassed that there was a connection between fear, loneliness, fear again from these moments from his past, and that he could actually now express that those moments existed, not just as moments where he overcame, moments where he triumphed, which he did, but also they were wrought with fear, with danger, with the possibility of death. And he was able to tell those and process those, I think, a little bit through our work together. Um, and I think all of that links up to why I'm constantly in therapy, why I'm constantly writing and making sure that I'm steering away from the fear of my experiences and the fear of how they might be interpreted or viewed by somebody I'm telling them to, and more just going through that moment of fear, going through that worry that it's going to drastically change how somebody views me or thinks about me. And instead thinking they may just see me as a human being. There's this line in my friend Alexis Chen Johnson is writing a book about her kind of wartime family experiences. And in her work, she says, the biggest secret that we had was that we were human. And I think that when I read that line, I complimented Lex so much. I was like, this is a brilliant line. This is what I'm trying to get at. Like, we don't have to be so afraid that we had human experiences and we don't have to like gloss them over and say, but I was triumphant. Like, you're allowed to have all the other things be a part of that.
Nice. Was there a specific story that your father told you that upended the way you thought about your own childhood?
Was there a specific story? I think it was kind of cumulative, but it was really in those 2 weeks where I think, as much as I talk about him shifting, I think I was shifting as well. Um, because I was very angry at him, and I didn't have the words or the capability to really express or process that when I was 21. I mean, I was kind of freshly coming out of that home environment. Um, so I was angry at him. I was angry at him, especially at the beginning of our recordings, and not saying it, not talking about it, because again, anger was another one of these things that you just put aside. You don't talk about it, you don't bring it up, you don't process it. But when he was telling me about being shot at by this plane and then going home and finding that his apartment was burned out and he is 10 years old, he looked at 10 years old from the few pictures that I have of him, just like me and all my siblings looked at 10 years old, and he looked small. So I had to, one of the, some of the questions early on came from that idea of my father being 10 years old and going through this. And I just kept going over in my head this pint-sized little person going through this now Nazi-occupied city and finding no home, no family. And I think when he asked me, don't you feel bad for me? I had reached a point myself where, yes, I do feel bad for you. Like, it's wild. It's beyond unfortunate. And it's brought a lot of love into my heart for my father that he went through that at that age.
Do you think he went through his life up until that point trying to get other people to feel bad for him or trying to act as if there was nothing that anybody needed to feel bad for him about?
Yeah, I think the latter. I think, as I mentioned before, these pat stories that he told contained these elements of like, a hero arc. And they contained these ways that he wanted to tell the story, which were ones that didn't leave a lot of room for sympathy for this little boy, but more like you were supposed to be in awe that he survived. And we were in awe that he survived, that he was, so adaptive to the environment and so such an outlier that this little boy survived this war. So I think he wanted the stories to stay in such a way that he was just cast as this hero and this um, not even survivor, right? More so a hero than a survivor. And again, the disruption of that narrative was what I brought to the table through our work together.
It's really fascinating. And you talk about the transformative power of claiming and telling one's own story. How did telling your father's story help you finally claim your own story?
I think a lot of that is still in the works because a lot, my book comes out in July. I think there'll be a lot of moments in the next year where I see how telling his story helps me to claim my own story in the real world. I think, though, that at some point I found a admiration for my father that he was doing this work, that he was telling these stories and on the good days answering my questions and going to places that he didn't necessarily want to go. So I think again I would say it probably was in the last 6 years where I incorporated that sense of his bravery and his willingness to go there into my own writing practice, really, and my willingness to say the things that maybe I was editing, that I was producing out of the stories so that they could be triumph stories or whatever they might have been then. I was now allowing for the messy bits to come through in my stories as well.
Yeah, the stories, all your stories are so fascinating. I think the thing that's going to ring around my head for quite a while is your dad saying, "Don't you feel sorry for me?" Because there seems to be so much wrapped in that vulnerability, realization,
Yeah.
acceptance, hopefully acceptance
Yeah.
from you. And you tell stories from the stage performance, and it's reached millions of people. What is it about that
Yeah.
specific intersection of immigration, immigrant trauma, and queer identity that you think is resonating so deeply with audiences?
Yeah. I mean, wow, that was a moment that I could not have seen coming. Although, as I was telling that story, I don't know if you are, do much performance work, but some performance work can feel just like another performance. Whereas there are some moments that feel like everything kind of comes together and almost like you and that audience are kind of in that room and this is a moment, right? And that's what I felt telling that story to that particular audience that day. And it is a story about how what my father experienced, how that influenced how he fathered me and the environment that I grew up in. It particularly brings out that moment in high school where my music teacher alerted me to the fact that I was good at something, which was really the first time in 16 years that somebody was saying that I was good at something. Um, so now I've forgotten the crux of your question. If you could remind me.
I actually already forgot too about the
Okay.
intersection of how your audience is responding to the intersection of immigrant trauma and your own queer identity.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the reminder. I think I was trying to make that connection in preparation for telling that story. And it came as a surprise that the audience found that connection as easily as I hoped they would. So it gave me an inkling that these two things were not that difficult for somebody who was going to read the manuscript or hear parts of these stories to make. That what happened then affected what happened 40 years later and affects even something that's happening 40 years after that because I was telling the story when I was, I don't know, 45 and still grappling with the echoes of a war that had happened many, many decades ago.
All right. Just have a couple questions left as we start to wind down the conversation. So, what advice would you give to someone who is currently navigating the fear of a parental figure, but wants to find a path towards understanding that parent?
I think one thing that I've I've considered as I've gotten older is that I wasn't really equipped to do the work that I was doing at 21 that I was doing. Um, I was new to support. So one thing about my particular family is like we are very isolative. Like we want to keep all of the secrets and all of the bad things contained within the home, and we don't want outside influences or support. Um, so when I talk about doing this work at 21 with my father and where I was at 21, which was really highly dysregulated by the life that I had lived up to that point. I didn't have a lot of psychological wading through of what had happened at that point. So, in retrospect, I would tell that boy, that young man, what I would probably tell a lot of people who want to explore this. I would, of course, say there are many benefits to me and my dad that we went through this process. But I would kind of caution and want for other people to have more supports than I did. So if this is something you want to pursue, perhaps look outside of yourself and the person you want to talk to first to discuss what you want to talk about. And this can be, for me now, I would honestly say, like, have a therapist on board, have your close friends and family on board and aware that you are going to do this work and have that at the ready to give you support that perhaps the person that you are sitting across from is not equipped to give you. Um, yes, there were breakthroughs through my conversations with my dad, but if I were then to go and, weep myself about what we had talked about early on, it was not a safe place for me to express that with the person I was sitting across from. So I would have liked to have had the supports outside of that relationship that I would suggest other people have.
Very, very wise advice. So, final question today. After years of interviews and the years of writing, what is the one thing you want readers to take away about the nature of forgiveness?
I think forgiveness is something that I want people to consider as process and also not a not just a I'm on this side of the fence and now I've left over here and now there's forgiveness. It is a path. It is a journey and there are moments still in retelling these stories and still working with the material of these stories where something reminds me that my dad was an abusive or neglectful father. And it's something that I have to look at and process and sit with now as a 49-year-old man who passed away in, you know, 2002. So I've lived almost as much of my life without my dad as I lived with my dad. And he's still a figure that can cause a moment in my life where I'm like, oh, this is some trauma or moment that happened way back then that I have to look at now. So I think forgiveness is like a maybe too easy a word because again, I don't think it's like you're leaping over into forgiveness. I think it's very much a process.
Makes total sense. Total sense. So, for everyone listening, Jason's book, War Boys, a father and son memoir, becomes available July 1st through Trio House Press. I recommend it for anyone trying to make sense of their own family map. You can find links to Jason's work and his stories from the stage performance in the show notes for this episode. So, our guest today has been Jason Prokowiew. Jason, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Melvin. It was a pleasure to talk to you. I'm looking forward to reading more of your work too.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of Stories from Real Life. Until next time, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.